So thank you for tuning in to what is a re-recording of the first session of the Cape Quarantined seminar series. This session was on popular and counterculture, and it was also an introduction to Mark Fisher's work. So the Cape Quarantine series then, just to briefly summarize, which I have the advantage of doing with the re-recording, it was a series of 5 seminars that discussed each of the following themes. So popular culture and counterculture, which was this week's theme, eco-criticism, which was our theme in week 2, the weird and eerie / the gothic in week 3, music criticism in week 4, and finally science fiction in our concluding week. We also had a guest lecture featuring Matt Colquhoun, author of Egress, which is the first piece, book-length work of secondary criticism on Mark Fisher. Each of the themes was really kind of feeding into and kind of anticipating and then reflecting on that lecture. So that lecture took place in between weeks 2 and 3. We also believe that these 5 themes haunted Fisher's work, and although he didn't always write about these things explicitly, there were always kind of implicit concerns. Some things he did write about more explicitly than others. So music criticism, for instance, is a huge part of Fisher's work. Eco-criticism is maybe not so central, but is something that is kind of backgrounded, or it's a topic, such a big issue that Fisher's work could always be kind of seen as relating to it. We were also asking broader questions with the seminar series. So we were interested in how Fisher's work was still relevant to the present moment. And by that we meant both the COVID-19 crisis and kind of since Fisher's passing, the central kind of issues of our present, whether they changed. And then we were also seeing if Fisher's work in relation to our themes could help us anticipate for what was coming next. So both after the COVID-19 crisis and sort of the mutations in capitalism, the problems brought about by climate change, what kind of our solutions could be. We're interested in these kind of broader theoretical ideas. So this first session then, which is probably the reason why you're watching this video, popular and counterculture. In this session, I was interested in focusing on the following. So how does Fisher use popular culture in his work, and does his approach change throughout his career? Thinking more broadly, and this was going to speak to kind of future weeks, the central question of this session was, how can popular culture be useful for theory? As you'll probably see if you watch any of the future discussions on this channel or website, or however you're engaging with this, that the popular culture kind of interfaces with theory in interesting ways. And that was something that was kind of central to Mark Fisher's career. This is the bit that many of you viewers might kind of disagree with, this division of kind of Mark Fisher's work. I think my approach to this was, I think there are 3 major folds in Fisher's work. The first is his early work, which occurred between 1994 and 2003. During this period, it was in a band called Degeneration, really right at the start of his I guess, academic kind of career, but also kind of professional output. He completed MSoc in Cultural Studies at Birmingham, during which time he was a member of a group called Switch. And I think Sadie Plant was at the institution during this period as well. And then he moved to Warwick following Sadie Plant and a few other people from the University of Birmingham to join and that's where he became involved with the CCRU, or Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. And I think that all these things kind of feed into the text of this early period. They're kind of a definitive moment, formative moment as well for Fisher's work. The second type of output then, and I've divided this, so from 2003 to 2016, is the K-Punk blog, probably one of his more famous modes of output. accepting capitalist realism, which I'll talk about in a moment. Here he wrote on a variety of topics, including music, commercial culture, science fiction, film, and politics. His approach was cultural theoretical, and the language here sometimes harkens back to earlier work. And then the final phase of Fisher's output, or what I've bracketed off because it happens kind of simultaneously with his blog work, from 2009 to 2017 is his sort of professional output. Here he published three books: Capitalist Realism is an Alternative, Ghosts of My Life, writings on depression, hauntology, and lost futures, and then The Weird and the Eerie. During his time as well, he started to write articles more prolifically for news journals, and that actually attracted a lot of people to Fisher's work because of the accessibility of the theory. So these folds are in no way definitive of Fisher's work. You may disagree, and there is definitely some overlap kind of between these categories as well. So the texts that we focused on in this week as well were the three that you probably see in front of you now. And I chose these texts because in some way they kind of explored popular or counterculture. And I think each is definitive of his output in these three periods in some way, or what I'm imagining these three periods to be. So the first is White Magic, written in the late 90s. So this is an extremely kind of jargon-heavy text, more a collage of theory and fiction, and was produced when Fisher was still a member of the CCRU. The second is from his blog, Robot Historian in the Ruins, from 2008. This is an analysis of the film WALL-E, and also briefly touches on the discourse around the Dark Knight film, which was then recently kind of rehashed around the Joker, which is something we did talk about in the sessions. And then our final, the final text that we were going to look at is Fading Privileged Girls, which is a review of Lena Dunham's show, which he wrote for the New Statesman. In this, Fisher makes comparisons of the show to the everyday experiences of precarity becoming more commonplace in a workplace. So zoning in on our kind of the first text that we've focused on for this session, I wanted to kind of highlight the different works that Fisher references throughout. And this was to try and get a handle on what this text was doing, this quite jargon heavy text. So as you'll see in this video, there's kind of a collage of texts on the screen. And this is in no way a definitive list. I think there's a few more than I could kind of fit on this slide. But you have references to Apocalypse Now, which was the obvious kind of entry point for popular culture for me when I was designing this session. And it's an interesting kind of resource for how it interacts with some of the theory presented in this kind of piece. More Brilliant Than the Sun, which I think is the biggest thing I've got highlighted here, was also kind of hugely influential as a source for Fisher, although it's only briefly mentioned in this essay, especially for how it kind of engages with the interplay between Black popular music and culture and science fiction, and myth as well, how it kind of engages with myth making and myth, which is something that's going on in this piece with some of the characters that you'll see throughout. The Ticket That Exploded is also an important source of inspiration for Fisher's collage in this piece, which kind of engages with Burroughs's cut-up technique and talks about it and references it throughout. And then the final one I wanted to highlight is the kind of Baudrillard. So symbolic exchange and death is the text I've got highlighted here. So Fisher is kind of reading this as a strategy guide, and not just as theory. And so the way he engages with kind of Baudrillard is quite interesting. It's not as someone that's just looking at the phenomenon of say kind of simulation. It's someone that's trying to create a kind of a strategy for coping, for dealing with it. And I think that's really summarizes what's important in theory for Fisher. So what was Fisher doing with White Magic? So he was creating new interactive possibilities between theory and literature. And he was doing this by producing a sort of science fiction kit of his own. And he was also exploring the idea of culture jamming, which is a practice of using the techniques of mainstream cultural institutions in a subversive way to expose the methods of domination by these institutions. But this piece is also kind of a critique of the deployment of this tactic and its viability in a contemporary sense. So, kind of more in line with our concerns today, then, is this kind of the context of this piece and Fisher's affiliation with the CCRU at this time. This context is really existed as a period where the CCRU was acting as an entity that developed in hostile conditions as a kind of conduit for continuing trade between popular culture and theory. This notion of kind of it existing as somewhere where kind of the interface between popular culture and theory was allowed to happen, wasn't kind of happen in an academic sense maybe elsewhere, is something that really we will probably get into when we talk about this piece in today's session. So leaving white magic behind us then, and kind of the introduction to that, I wanted to move into talking about the K-Punk blog before talking about the second text that I think is definitive of Fisher's work. These kind of quotes, and particularly the last two, suggest that his blog referenced the sort of media that got him into theoretical work in the first place, the music press or the Inkies. Whereas kind of the top quote I have here, it kind of suggests continuity with the CCRU's work. Just to read these out then. So Matt Colquhoun, quoting Fisher, says, "It isn't me who's writing. To describe how he's able to write and keep writing would be to give only a technical description of how this body has been used as a meat puppet for channeling utinal signal." Jenny Turner in No Longer But Not Yet quotes Fisher, "It seemed like a space, the only space in which to maintain a kind of discourse that started in the music press and the art schools, which had all but died out." And then finally, also from the Jenny Turner piece, Fisher learned a lot about fine art, European cinema, avant-garde literature from names dropped by artists and journalists in the Inkies. No sob stories, but for someone of my background, it's difficult to see where else that interest would have come from. So the second piece that I highlighted then, Robot Historian in the Ruins, is kind of exemplary of Fisher's blog output. And in this blog post, Fisher explores three theories in relation to the films WALL-E and The Dark Knight. So he suggests that these films can operate as meta-commodities, or commodities which facilitate contradictory discussions through their messaging, while still producing profit for capital. So regardless of the message, the discourse that surrounds a film like The Dark Knight, whether it was kind of a left-leaning anarchist film or quite a conservative film in its message, and really that conflict of discourse was only there to kind of help it sell. The second point Fisher expands is he explains ideology, which is the idea that capitalism doesn't need to be believed in to be the dominant narrative. It's something that's just pervasive anyway. And WALL-E as a film, Fisher looks at this and he kind of explains that it's an anti-capitalist film that is kind of pro-capitalist in its end message. And then finally, there's this theory, this kind of strand of anti-anthropocentrism, where the best part. So he asks, kind of, were the best parts of WALL-E the silent bits before the humans were involved? So moving that past kind of the K-Punk blog output, which we discussed more in our seminar sessions, our final text was Fading Privileged Girls. So Fisher positively reflects on the show's representation of a white middle-class privilege in decline in this session. And he does this in a few ways. So the first, he makes a comparison to Sex and the City and how work was kind of absent from this 90s series, but is now kind of a central component of Girls. And by doing this, he invokes these kind of ideas of precarious labour. And how now work being the focus of the show shows that kind of labour has become a very pervasive, a more pervasive thing within our culture. And then he suggests that this kind of links to the rise in precarity in the 1990s. The second thing he looks at is workplace anxiety. So increasing anxieties around social awkwardness within everyday working environments. And the final thing is kind of linked to this idea of kind of an unacceptable behaviour. He explains how the rules that govern social acceptability themselves can be precarious, especially in the workplace. So there's a kind of a lack of clarity regarding the rules of social conduct, and these kind of rules aren't set in advance, and because of that, people tend to put their foot in their mouth quite a lot. So, to kind of summarise my views on Fisher's work, these three works really, and the reason why I wanted to look at them, they show us a trajectory in Fisher's work of a movement away from an esotericism to a sort of populism. However, they also show us how kind of popular culture can be attributed to theory in three different ways. So the first one was, as with kind of white magic then, pop culture can be used to kind of construct a theory. The second was that theory can also be used to critique popular culture. So that's what's happening in Robot Historian in the Ruins, most explicitly. But then the third, and it's slightly different. So theory can kind of be extrapolated from within popular culture. And that's really how Fisher kind of draws theory out of Lena Dunham's Girls. But there is kind of a continuity between Fisher's work as well. And this was something else for discussion I wanted to highlight. He still engages with popular cultural forms, but he does so in a more extensive way than he did originally. And this was so kind of following the mantra that was present on the title slide of this presentation. It follows this creed that sorcerers don't create, they participate. And so, as with Fisher's later work, he stops trying to construct a theory. He's just participating with the cultural forms that are already there. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the other materials on our website.